The metal bench was bolted to the grimy concrete floor of cell block C, just like every other piece of furniture in this forgotten corner of the world. I'd been watching the dust motes dance in the sliver of light from the high barred window for what felt like an eternity. 3 years, 6 months, and 14 days. That was my sentence. Now, as the first screams echoed through the cold institutional halls, I wondered if it was also my death warrant. This wasn't my first rodeo with chaos. I'd seen riots in here before, heard the desperate howls of men losing their minds, but this was different. The screams weren't the usual rage or defiance. They were pure, unadulterated terror, like an animal caught in a trap. And they weren't just coming from the usual places, the common room, the mess hall. They were everywhere, overlapping, spreading. A guard's voice, tinny and panicked over the intercom, tried to cut through the rising cacophony. "Lockdown! All inmates return to cells! Repeat, lockdown! Code red! Code rut!" The transmission abruptly cut out, replaced by a garbled shriek that sent a jolt of ice through my veins. It wasn't human, not anymore. My cellmate, a hooking brute named Thorne, with a teardrop tattoo under his eye for every man he'd allegedly killed, sat bolt upright on his bunk. His face, usually a mask of bored menace, was pale. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, his voice surprisingly thin. The collective roar that followed answered him. It was a wave of sound, a primal bellowing that shook the very foundations of a prison. Heavy impacts slammed against distant doors, a sickening wet thud I couldn't quite place, but my gut recoiled from it. The air, usually thick with the scent of stale sweat and disinfectant, now carried a faint, coppery tang. Blood. This was it. This was the end of the world they'd been whispering about on smuggled cell phones, the news reports of a fast-spreading contagion overseas. We'd laughed at it, dismissed it as another government conspiracy. Now, the conspiracy was kicking down our doors, and we were trapped on the inside, serving our time for crimes against humanity, only to be devoured by humanity itself. This wasn't just a prison anymore. This was a meat grinder. 24 hours to escape hell, the thought hammered in my skull. That's all I had, if I was lucky. The lights flickered, plunging the block into momentary darkness before buzzing back to life with a sickly orange glow. Through the reinforced steel bars of my cell door, I could see the narrow corridor. Nothing. But the sounds, they were getting closer. The shuffled, drag thump of dozens, maybe hundreds of feet. And that moan, a low, guttural symphony of agony and hunger. "They're here," Thorne whispered, his hand going to the crude shiv he kept hidden under his mattress. He wasn't scared of men, I knew that. But this was something new, something that defied everything we understood about survival. The inmate versus zombie war had just started, and we were the first line of defense, utterly defenseless. A distant siren wailed, abruptly dying in a choke of static. Then silence. An unnatural, terrifying silence, broken only by the incessant, dragging footsteps outside our cell block. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird desperate to flee. I squeezed my eyes shut for a second, picturing my sister's face, my old apartment, the taste of a cold beer. It was all gone. Everything. "Stay quiet," I hissed at Thorn, even though my own breath hitched in my throat. Every fiber of my being screamed to make noise, to bang on the bars, to demand to be let out. But instinct, the kind that had kept me alive on the streets and then inside these walls, told me silence was my only weapon right now. The first of them appeared at the far end of the corridor. A guard, or what was left of one. His uniform was ripped, stained a dark, sickening crimson. His jaw hung slack, exposing rows of yellowed teeth. His eyes, milky and unfocused, stared straight ahead, seeing nothing and everything at once. He lurched, stumbled, then righted himself, shuffling forward with that horrifying, unceasing moan. Behind him, more shapes emerged from the gloom. Inmates, their orange jumpsuits torn, bloodied, some missing chunks of flesh, others with limbs bent at impossible angles. They moved with the same relentless, hungry shuffle. They weren't angry. They weren't even alive, not in any way that mattered. They were just hunger, given form. They reached the first row of cells, clawing at the bars, their moans intensifying. The sound was a physical thing, vibrating through the metal, through my very bones. One of them, a gaunt inmate I vaguely recognized from the laundry room, slammed his head repeatedly against the steel door of a nearby cell, leaving a smear of dark fluid. The desperate banging from inside that cell, which had been constant moments ago, abruptly stopped. An open loop. Another victim. Thorn pulled his shiv, its dull gleam barely visible in the dim light. He gripped it so hard his knuckles went white. "They can't get through the bars, can they?" he asked, a plea in his voice. I looked at the thick steel, at the reinforced concrete. The prison was designed to keep us in, but it wasn't designed to keep these things out. Not when they didn't feel pain, didn't feel exhaustion, didn't feel anything but the primal urge to feed. "The bars will hold for a while," I said, trying to inject a confidence I didn't feel into my voice. "But they're not gonna just leave." The infected started to gather, pressing against the cell doors, a solid mass of writhing bodies. The moaning grew into a monstrous chorus, a chilling soundtrack to the end of the world. One of them, a particularly large inmate, began to pull at the bars of a cell 2 doors down, his immense strength testing the metal. It groaned, a deep, protesting sound that was sickeningly loud in the confined space. "We need a plan," I said, my mind racing. "We can't just sit here." Thorn grunted. "What plan, smart guy? We're locked in a box. The only people with keys are probably already one of them." He gestured vaguely at the growing horde, his eyes wide. He was right, but despair was a luxury I couldn't afford. Not now. Not when I could still feel the beat of my own heart, still draw a ragged breath. My entire life had been about finding a way out of impossible situations. This was just the biggest one yet. The guard station. That was our best bet. It was at the end of the block, protected by a reinforced door, and it housed the master control panel for the cell doors. If anyone was still alive in there, they might have a plan, or at least a key. But it was a death trap getting there. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the moaning, closer this time. It came from the cell right next to ours. A young kid named Mikey, in for petty theft, had been sobbing hysterically for the last 10 minutes. The screams abruptly choked off, replaced by a sickening, wet, tearing sound. The cell door shook violently. Then the moaning from inside intensified, deeper, hungrier. Mikey was gone, or worse. An open loop of absolute horror. Thorne swore under his breath, stumbling backward against the wall. His fear was palpable, contagious. My own stomach churned. We were next. This wasn't a question of if they'd get in, but when. And when they did, we would be trapped, unable to fight, unable to run. 24 hours to escape hell wasn't enough time. It was a countdown to execution. My eyes scanned our cell. A small metal sink, a toilet, the 2 bunks. Nothing that could be used as a weapon. Nothing that could break these bars. The only thing I had was my wits and a lifetime of learning how to survive when the odds were stacked against me. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and forced myself to think. The inmate versus zombie war was just beginning, and I refused to be a casualty. Not yet. The air in the cell block was growing thicker, heavy with the scent of decay. The moaning outside our cell intensified, a dozen or more infected, pressing against the steel, their hands, or what remained of them, clawing uselessly at the hardened metal. The clanking of keys from the guard station, which had been a constant, reassuring sound for years, was now replaced by the wet sloshing of bodies and the occasional sickening crack of bone. My internal clock screamed, "Time is running out!" "There has to be a way," I muttered, pacing the cramped confines of the cell. 2 steps one way, 2 steps back, like a caged animal, which, I realized with a bitter twist, I was. Thorne, surprisingly, was calmer now. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a grim resignation, or perhaps a predatory focus. "We ain't breaking out of here, man," he said, still clutching his shiv. "These walls are solid. We're better off waiting for them to die off, or for the military to clean this up." I scoffed. "Military? You heard the intercom. That guard was screaming code red. That means full-scale collapse. If the military gets involved, it'll be to bomb the whole damn place, not save us." I thought of the news reports, the vague, unsettling images of cities burning overseas. This isn't just a prison outbreak, Thorne. This is the end, and nobody's coming to save us. We're on our own. The truth of it hung in the air, cold and heavy. We were statistics, forgotten men in a forgotten place. Our lives, already deemed worthless by society, were now even less so. But I wasn't ready to accept that. My name was Cain, and I'd clawed my way out of worse holes than this. This inmate versus zombie war was just another game, albeit one with higher stakes. I looked at the ceiling. Vents, too small, too high. The toilet bowl, porcelain, brittle. The sink, metal but flimsy. The bunk, bolted down. My gaze fell on the metal frame of the bunk itself, the cold, unforgiving steel that supported my meager existence. It was sturdy, too sturdy. But maybe... "Thorne," I said, a spark of an idea igniting in my brain. "Help me with this bunk." He looked at me, an eyebrow raised. "What for? You gonna try to ram the door open?" "No, We're gonna break it apart, or at least try to. We need a weapon, something more than that toothpick you're holding." He considered it for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but if this gets us killed, I'm haunting your ass." The bunks were designed not to be moved, not to be disassembled. They were steel frames welded to steel posts, all bolted to the floor and wall. But years of inmate ingenuity had taught me that nothing was truly impossible to break if you had enough time, enough leverage, and enough desperation. We began to strain, pulling at the corners, prying at the bolted points. The metal groaned, screeched, but held firm. Sweat beaded on my forehead, stinging my eyes. The moaning from outside was a constant reminder of the encroaching horror. Each groan of the metal was a tiny victory, a defiance against the inevitable. Suddenly, a new sound, closer than the others, split the air. Clang! Crack! It came from the cell directly across from us. The large, infected inmate I'd seen earlier had finally done it. He'd torn one of the bars from its mounting point, leaving a jagged gap. The sound of metal twisting, screaming, and the moans now mixed with eager snarls as other infected surged toward the new opening. "They're getting in!" Thorne yelled, a fresh wave of panic in his voice. I pulled harder on the bunk frame, my muscles burning. "We don't have time! We need to move!" My hands were raw, my breath ragged. The bolts were loosening, just barely. The metal shrieked again. Then, with a final, protesting pop, one corner of the bunk detached from the wall. Not much, but it was a start. A loose piece of hollow steel, about 3 feet long. Not a sword, but better than nothing. I gripped the detached piece of steel. It was heavy, unwieldy, but it was something. My makeshift weapon. From the cell across, a grotesque head pushed through the newly created gap. Eyes milky, teeth bared. It snarled, a wet, rasping sound, then squeezed its shoulders through, followed by a torn, bloodied arm. It was a nightmare in slow motion. The other infected outside were still pulling, pushing, widening the breach. "We need to get out now!" I gasped, holding the steel bar like a club. The cell door was still locked, still reinforced, but my mind was already racing, finding an alternative. "The utility chase, the one behind the toilets!" Thorne looked at me, then at the infected across the way, then back at me. "Are you insane? That's barely wide enough for a rat." "It's wide enough for us," I retorted, desperation sharpening my voice. "And it leads to the maintenance tunnels. They might lead us out of the block, maybe even out of the prison. It's our only chance." He looked at the small, square panel on the wall behind the toilet, the one that covered the access to the plumbing and electrical lines. It was held in place by 4 small screws, usually stripped and painted over. Useless. But with a heavy steel bar, the first infected had almost squeezed entirely through the gap in the opposite cell. Its legs thrashed, its moans echoing. In minutes, it would be free. And then it would turn its attention to us. "All right, Kane," Thorne said, a grim resolve settling on his face. "Let's make some noise." He grabbed the other detached section of the bunk frame, a longer, heavier piece of angle iron. A brutal, crude bludgeon. The inmate versus zombie war was no longer a theoretical concept. It was here, and we were fighting for our lives. The small, square access panel behind the toilet was a flimsy piece of sheet metal, but it was set into concrete. My steel bar felt inadequate, a child's toy against the might of the prison walls. Yet, what other choice did we have? The infected, a grotesque, lurching horror, was now fully inside the cell across from us. It turned, sniffing the air, its dead eyes sweeping the empty bunks before locking onto our cell. Its moans sharpened, becoming a hungry snarl. "Hit it!" I shouted at Thorn, pointing at the access panel. "Hard! Forget quiet!" He didn't hesitate. With a primal roar, he swung the heavy angle iron. Crack! The sound echoed through the cell, a defiant challenge to the encroaching horde. The panel buckled, groaning. Crack! Crack! Again and again, Thorn brought the heavy metal down, each blow a release of pent-up fear and rage. The screws shrieked, tearing through the rusted metal. Dust and plaster rained down. The noise, however, was a magnet. The infected across the corridor, now several strong, were alerted. Their moans turned to a frenzied chorus of guttural snarls. They began to pull at our cell bars, rattling them with newfound ferocity. The thing that had just gotten into the opposite cell, hearing the commotion, started shambling towards us, its movements jerky and unnatural. It was a race against time, a desperate, brutal race. I joined Thorn, slamming my shorter steel bar against the panel where it had buckled. The sheet metal ripped, peeling back like a festering wound. The stench of stale sewage and damp concrete immediately wafted out, a disgusting perfume, but a scent of freedom nonetheless. Behind the panel was darkness and the faint, unsettling drip, drip, drip of unseen water. "It's almost through," Thorn grunted, sweat pouring down his face as he delivered another bone-jarring blow. With a final agonizing shriek of tearing metal, the panel ripped free, leaving a gaping, jagged hole. Beyond it was a narrow, dark shaft. The utility chase. A perfect escape route, if we could fit. "You first," I yelled at Thorn, shoving him towards the opening. He was bigger than me. If he could make it, I could. He hesitated for a split second, glancing at the infected across the way, which was now less than 10 feet from our cell door, its arms reaching, its dead fingers brushing against the bars. Then, with a grunt, Thorn squeezed himself into the opening, grunting and cursing as he forced his bulk through. The sound of his struggle, the scraping of his clothes against the rough concrete, was loud. The infected at our bars went into a frenzy, sensing our imminent escape. The metal of our cell door groaned under the assault, protesting against the relentless pressure. "Hurry," I urged, pushing against his back. I could feel the cold blast of foul air from the chase, a mixture of mold, rust, and sewage. It was the smell of salvation. Just as Thorn's legs disappeared into the shaft, a fresh, sickening crack came from our cell door. One of the welded points where the bars met the frame had fractured. A single, ominous hairline crack. It wouldn't hold much longer. I could see the other inmates, the ones who were still themselves in their cells further down the block, staring at us with wide, horrified eyes, a silent plea for help. What would you have done? Left them or tried to save them, knowing it would doom you? I made a choice, born of pure, selfish survival instinct. I looked away. "I'm through," Thorn's muffled voice echoed from below. "Coming." I grabbed my steel bar, took one last look at the snarling faces pressed against my cell bars, at the fractured weld, at the empty, blood-stained cell of Mikey. This inmate versus zombie war was just getting started. I squeezed myself into the opening, pushing with my legs, scraping my back against the rough concrete. The jagged edges of the broken panel tore at my jumpsuit, but I didn't care. Adrenaline surged through me, dulling the pain. I could feel cold, dead fingers brush against my foot as I pulled it through, a sickening reminder of how close I'd come to becoming another meal. I dropped into the darkness, landing awkwardly on a narrow metal walkway, barely wide enough for my feet. Thorn was already several feet ahead, his heavy breathing the only sound in the suffocating blackness. The utility chase was a labyrinth of pipes, wires, and shadows. The air was thick, heavy, tasting of dust and moisture. The only light came from the intermittent gaps where the floorboards were missing, letting in slivers of the prison's sickly yellow glow. "Stay close," I whispered, my voice hoarse, "and move quietly." Every sound echoed, magnified. The clang of a dropped pipe, the scrape of a shoe, could draw unwanted attention. We were deep inside the belly of the beast, navigating its hidden arteries. 24 hours to escape hell felt like a pipe dream in this suffocating darkness. This was a nightmare. We moved slowly, painstakingly, through the narrow, twisting passages. The floor was slick with condensation, the metal pipes cold and grimy. Sometimes a burst pipe would spray cold, fetid water onto us, but we pushed on, ignoring the discomfort, focused only on escape. The distant sounds of the infected, their moans and snarls, were thankfully fading, replaced by the eerie silence of the prison's inner workings. After what felt like an hour, Thorn stopped abruptly. "Hold up," he whispered. "I hear something." I froze, straining my ears. A faint, rhythmic clink, clink, metallic. Not the shuffle of the infected, more deliberate, human. Movement ahead, I breathed, gripping my steel bar tighter. Could it be another survivor? A guard, or something worse? Another desperate inmate, just as dangerous as the infected. The inmate versus zombie war wasn't just about fighting the dead. It was about surviving the living, too. This prison was full of men who would kill you for a stale piece of bread, let alone a shot at freedom. "What do we do?" Thorn asked, his voice low. "We find out who it is," I said, a grim resolve settling over me. "And we make sure they don't stop us." We crept forward, each step deliberate, each breath held. The metallic clinking grew louder, accompanied by the muffled scrape of something heavy being dragged. The utility chase was about to become a battleground. We rounded a bend in the narrow service tunnel, the source of the clinking sound immediately apparent. A single figure, hunched over, was painstakingly dragging a heavy toolbox across the metal grating. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit, like us, but his was relatively clean. He moved with a meticulous, almost obsessive focus, oblivious to our presence. "Hold it right there," I barked, my voice echoing, startling him. He jumped, dropping the toolbox with a loud clang, and spun around, a small wrench clutched in his hand like a desperate weapon. He was a scrawny, bespectacled man, probably in his late 30s or early 40s. I recognized him. Specs, they called him. In for corporate espionage, if the rumors were true. He was the kind of inmate who faded into the background, avoided conflict, always had his nose in a book. The last person I'd expect to find in the bowels of the prison during a full-blown zombie apocalypse. His eyes, magnified by thick glasses, were wide with terror. "Whoa, whoa, don't shoot. I'm unarmed. Mostly." He gestured nervously with the wrench. "Put it down," Thorne growled, stepping forward, his heavy angle iron looking like a medieval bludgeon in his hand. Specs immediately dropped the wrench, raising his hands in surrender. Okay, no trouble, guys. Just trying to get out, same as you." "What are you doing down here?" I demanded, my steel bar still raised. "And where do these tunnels lead?" He gulped, adjusting his glasses. I'm trying to reroute power to the old maintenance exit. It's supposed to bypass the main security grid. My expertise is electrical systems. The guard station will be compromised. This is the only way." He gestured vaguely further down the tunnel. "And these tunnels, they run all under the prison, past the workshops, under the yard, towards the perimeter fence." My heart gave a leap. A perimeter fence. Not a main gate, but a fence, a weak point, and he knew how to bypass the security. This was more than hope. It was a goddamn miracle. "You know how to get us out?" I think so," Specs stammered, his eyes darting between Thorne and me. "I was working on a project in the old electrical room. Heard the screams, got down here before they got to cell block D." "And the power? You said reroute power. Why?" "The old exit has an automated locking system. It needs power to open. And the main grid is probably down, or overloaded. I have to find a junction box, hotwire it." "How long will that take?" Thorne asked, his voice impatient. Specs wrung his hands. "Well, if I had the right tools, maybe an hour or two. But with what I have here..." He gestured to his toolbox, which had spilled open slightly, revealing a few screwdrivers, a multimeter, and some frayed wires. "It could take longer, a lot longer. And it's not exactly safe down here either. The deeper tunnels, I heard things, thumps, growls." "You heard things?" I pressed him. "Infected?" He nodded, a shiver running through his thin frame. "I think so. Some of the service tunnels lead to restricted areas, old storage. Maybe some got in through vents or through the drainage systems." Great. So not only were we locked in an inmate versus zombie war, we were now traversing under the battlefield, potentially straight into a nest of them. But Specs was our only way out, our gamble. "All right, Specs," I said, lowering my bar. "You lead, we protect. You get us out of here, we make sure nothing gets to you." He looked at me, then at Thorne, a flicker of something that looked like relief, or maybe just renewed terror, crossing his face. "Deal," he whispered. "Absolutely. Let's go. But quiet, please. Very, very quiet." He picked up his toolbox, the metallic clink, now a reassuring sound, the sound of progress. We began to move again, Specs leading the way, his soft footsteps the only sound apart from the occasional drip of water. The air grew colder, heavier. The tunnels became narrower, darker, forcing us to move in single file. Specs pointed out various pipes and conduits, muttering to himself about voltage and current. His technical jargon, a strange comfort in the hellish reality. Suddenly, he stopped, holding up a hand. The metallic clinking ceased. I froze, my senses on high alert. The dripping water, the distant, muffled moans from far above, those were constant. But there was something else. A subtle scraping sound just ahead, and a low, wet gurgle. My blood ran cold. "What is it?" Thorne whispered, his voice barely audible. Spex's face was pale, his eyes wide behind his glasses. He pointed a trembling finger down the tunnel. I think it's one of them, right around that bend. It sounds close. This wasn't some open corridor where we could swing our heavy bars with abandon. This was a confined space, a killing tunnel. One wrong move, one loud sound, and we could be swarmed. This was the true inmate versus zombie war, not just against the horde, but against claustrophobia, against the fear of the unknown that lurked in the dark. 24 hours to escape hell now meant navigating its darkest, most forgotten corners. We needed to be silent, deadly, and utterly merciless. The scraping sound intensified, accompanied by a wet, rhythmic snort. It sounded like something was rooting around in the darkness, tearing at something. The gurgle grew louder, a sickening, phlegmy noise. Specs was trembling, barely able to hold his toolbox steady. Thorn gripped his angle iron, his knuckles white. "Stay back," I whispered, holding up a hand. I moved forward cautiously, steel bar held low, my bare feet padding silently on the slick metal floor. Each step was deliberate, each breath shallow. The stench of decay, faint at first, was growing stronger. It assaulted my nostrils, a familiar smell of death that was becoming the scent of the new world. I reached the bend, pressing myself against the cold concrete wall. I peered around, my heart thudding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The beam from a flickering emergency light, probably damaged, cast eerie, shifting shadows in the tunnel ahead. And there it was. It was an inmate, or what was left of one. Its orange jumpsuit was shredded, revealing patches of rotten flesh and bone. Its head was down, buried in the carcass of a maintenance worker whose body was splayed out on the floor. It was tearing at the worker's chest cavity, the wet, ripping sounds almost unbearable. The gurgling was its feasting. The sight made my gorge rise, but I forced myself to focus. One, just one, and it was occupied. This was our chance. I signaled to Thorn, holding up a single finger, then mimed a quiet approach and a strike to the head. He nodded, a grim determination replacing the fear in his eyes. Specs, meanwhile, had pressed himself against the wall, trying to make himself invisible. We crept forward, Thorn taking the lead this time, his heavy footfalls surprisingly light. The tunnel was just wide enough for two men to move abreast. The stench of blood and feces was overwhelming now, a thick, putrid cloud. The zombie was still focused on its meal, oblivious to our approach. Thorn raised his angle iron high, the dim emergency light catching a glint of metal. He brought it down with a sickening crunch. The sound of bone and cartilage splintering was surprisingly loud in the confined space. The infected bucked once, a violent spasm, its head snapping back, revealing a face covered in dark, viscous fluid. It twitched, then slumped forward, unmoving. "Headshots," I said, my voice barely a whisper, a grim mantra for survival. Always the head. We quickly moved past the fallen infected, stepping over the gruesome scene. Specs, eyes wide and unfocused, hurried past, almost tripping over his own feet. He didn't look at the bodies, couldn't. "All right, Specs," I said, trying to keep him focused. "Where's this junction box?" He pointed ahead, his hand still trembling. Just a little further. There should be a junction box up ahead. It's part of the old power grid. If it's still connected, I can tap into it. The tunnel opened slightly, revealing a wider chamber filled with old, abandoned machinery, rusted pipes, and a dizzying array of electrical conduits. Cobwebs hung thick from the ceiling, shimmering in the sporadic light. The air here was cooler, more stagnant, and something else. A faint, low growl that made the hair on my arms stand on end. Not one, multiple. Specs froze, his eyes darting around the chamber. "They're in here," he whispered, fear making his voice crack. "More than one. I can hear them." My eyes scanned the shadows. The chamber was a perfect ambush point, too many places for them to hide. And our weapons, though effective, were slow, loud. Suddenly, a low moan echoed from behind a stack of rusted barrels. Then another from an old conveyor belt. Shadows stirred. 2, then 3 figures emerged, lurching forward, their dead eyes fixing on us. They were different from the ones upstairs, more decayed, their movements slower, almost sluggish, as if they'd been down here for a long time, cut off from fresh sustenance, but no less dangerous. "Junction box," I yelled, pointing to a massive metal box bolted to the far wall, a tangle of thick wires spilling out of it. "Can you get to it?" Specs nodded, his face pale. "Yes, but I need time. I need to—" "Thorn, cover him. Keep 'em off him." Thorn didn't need to be told twice. With a roar, he charged the first 2 infected, swinging his angle iron in a wide arc. Crack! One dropped, its head a pulpy mess. The other stumbled, giving him an opening. He brought the bar down again, and it too crumpled to the ground. But more were coming. 4, 5, emerging from the shadows. The inmate versus zombie war had just escalated to close quarters combat. I joined him, swinging my shorter steel bar. The first one was a thin, emaciated figure, its skin drawn tight over its bones. I slammed the bar into its chest. It staggered, but didn't fall. Its decayed hands reached for me, its breath a foul miasma. I recoiled, then brought the bar around in a horizontal sweep, catching its head. The impact jarred my teeth, but it dropped, finally. Another one, bigger, slower, shambled toward me. I dodged its clumsy lunge, twisting around its back, and slammed the bar into the back of its skull. It fell, its legs twitching. This was brutal, exhausting work. Every swing was a test of strength, every dodge a gamble. Behind me, I could hear the frantic sounds of Specs working, the clink of tools, the hum of electricity. He was scrambling, desperately trying to hotwire the junction box. "Almost there!" he shouted, his voice strained. Just a few more connections." Thorn was a whirling dervish of steel and fury. He dropped 3 more, but 2 new ones were pressing him, their decaying hands clawing at his arms, his chest. He roared, shoving them back, blood trickling from a shallow scratch on his forearm. My heart seized. Infection. I hoped it was just a scratch. We couldn't afford a casualty, not now. I lunged, drawing one of the infected away from Thorn, giving him some breathing room. It turned its vacant gaze on me, its mouth opening in a silent snarl. I brought my bar down again, a powerful, desperate swing. Crack! It dropped, its skull caved in. "Got it!" Specs screamed, his voice triumphant. The old junction box hummed to life, a surge of power crackling through the air. A distant thump echoed through the tunnels. The maintenance exit, it had opened. "Go!" Go! Go! I yelled, turning, pushing Thorn toward Specs. He was panting, his face covered in sweat and grime, the scratch on his arm a stark red line. But he was alive. We were alive. For now. We scrambled past Specs, who was already running, energized by his success. The tunnel ahead was brighter, a faint gray light emanating from the end. Freedom was within reach. But the sounds behind us were growing, the thumping, the moaning. We'd cleared a path, but the noise of our fight and the sudden surge of power would have drawn more of them. Many more. "Move! Don't look back!" I shouted, adrenaline coursing through me. This was the final push, the escape from the prison's bowels into what? The outside world. But the inmate versus zombie war wasn't over. It was just moving to a different battlefield. And my 24 hours to escape hell were ticking down fast. The maintenance tunnel finally opened into a larger, cavernous space. The air here was fresher, carrying the faint, metallic scent of rain and damp earth. A sliver of pale pre-dawn light streamed through a grimy, reinforced grate high above. This was it. The old maintenance exit, a forgotten gate at the very edge of the prison grounds, far from the main complex. Specs, still panting, pointed to a heavy, rust-eaten steel door. "There, that's it. It should be open now, but it's manual operation from this side. Heavy duty. Needs a lot of leverage." He looked at our steel bars. "These might work, if we can get 'em through the mechanism." Behind us, from the tunnel we'd just exited, the moaning was growing louder, a lot louder, and closer. They were coming. We hadn't just fought them off, we'd led them straight to our escape route. "No time," Thorn gasped, his eyes darting to the tunnel entrance. "Just get it open!" The scratch on his arm looked angrier, inflamed. I tried not to think about it. The door was a massive slab of steel, clearly designed to withstand a siege. A thick, rusted locking mechanism, a series of heavy bolts, was visible where the power had unlocked it. But it still needed to be manually pushed or pried open. We jammed our steel bars into the gaps around the bolts, straining, pushing, grunting with effort. The metal groaned, protesting. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest. My hands were raw, slick with sweat and grime. "It's not moving!" Specs cried, his voice on the verge of tears. "Push, damn it!" I roared, desperation fueling my strength. The sound of shuffling feet was now clearly audible, just beyond the tunnel entrance. They were right there. A surge of fear, cold and sharp, cut through my exhaustion. Suddenly, a loud, braiding clunk. The door shifted, just an inch. The bolts had recessed. We now had a small crack, wide enough for a hand, a foot, but not a body, not yet. "Again!" Thorn grunted, pushing with all his might. The door scraped against the concrete, agonizingly slowly. Another inch, then two. The pale light outside was getting brighter, revealing a narrow, overgrown dirt path leading away from the prison wall. Freedom, so close. Then, from the tunnel behind us, the first of them appeared. A tide of orange jumpsuits and rotting flesh, their moans a deafening chorus. They saw us, their empty eyes fixed on us, and their shuffling gait sped up, transforming into a desperate, hungry lunge. "Last push!" I screamed, jamming my bar into the gap and twisting. Thorn roared beside me, putting his entire weight into his bar. Specs, terrified, added his meager strength. The door grated, screamed, and then with a final protesting thud, it lurched open just enough for one person to squeeze through. "Go, Specs, go!" I yelled, shoving him towards the opening. He didn't hesitate, scrambling through the gap like a startled rabbit. Thorn followed, his larger frame barely fitting, scraping against the rough metal. I was last. I turned, raising my steel bar, ready to meet the wave. They were upon me, a dozen or more, their decaying hands reaching. I swung, catching the first one in the face, sending it sprawling. The second one lunged, and I felt its teeth scrape against my shoulder. A searing pain, but I didn't stop. I jammed my bar into its throat, pushing it back, creating a precious second of space. "Kane, get out!" Thorn yelled from the other side. I backed into the gap, turning sideways, forcing my body through the narrow opening. My shoulder screamed as it scraped against the rusted metal, a sharp, white-hot pain. But I was through, free. I stumbled out onto the dirt path, gasping for breath, my muscles screaming. Thorn and Specs were already several yards away, looking back, their faces etched with a mixture of terror and relief. Behind us, the maintenance exit, left ajar, became a funnel. The infected, dozens of them, were already pouring through the narrow gap, their relentless moans filling the morning air. We had escaped the prison walls, but we were far from safe. This was just the beginning of the inmate versus zombie war in the open world. "Run!" I screamed, turning and pushing myself forward, the searing pain in my shoulder a dull throb compared to the terror of being overrun. We ran, blindly, desperately, down the overgrown path. The prison walls, a symbol of both our former captivity and our hard-won freedom, now receding behind us. The early morning sun, a pale, anemic disk in the hazy sky, cast long, grotesque shadows. We hadn't made it to the countryside, not yet. This was still the outskirts of the prison complex, a forgotten patch of wasteland used for dumping old equipment and building materials. Rusty barbed wire fences, collapsed sheds, and mounds of decaying concrete dotted the landscape. A single, dilapidated guard tower stood sentinel, its windows shattered, its metal frame creaking mournfully in the faint breeze. We scrambled over a low, crumbling wall, our breath ragged, our legs burning. The noise of the infected pouring out of the maintenance exit was fading, but the sound of our own desperate panting was deafening in my ears. Specs, surprisingly, had a decent pace, his long, gangly legs churning. Thorn, though strong, was already showing signs of exhaustion, his movements less fluid. And the scratch on his arm, it was a constant, nagging worry. "We need a vehicle," Thorn gasped, pointing towards a cluster of larger metal-roofed structures in the distance. "Looks like a motor pool, or something." I squinted. Through the haze, I could make out several faded green shapes. Utility trucks, work vans, a vehicle. That was our best chance to cover serious ground, to truly escape the immediate hell of the prison. "All right," I said, forcing air into my burning lungs. "But we go slow. We stick to cover. No noise unless we have to." My experience on the outside, then my years inside, had taught me caution. Never underestimate an enemy, living or dead, and never trust a seemingly clear path. We moved stealthily, using the rusted fences and piles of debris as cover. The smell of decay was still present, carried on the breeze, but it was mixed with the fresh scent of pine and damp earth, a mocking reminder of a world that once was. As we neared the cluster of buildings, the silence became unsettling, too quiet. No distant moans, no shuffling, just the rustle of leaves and our own pounding hearts. My gut clenched. This was never a good sign. "Wait," I whispered, holding up a hand. "I hear something." A faint, rhythmic squeaking and a low, almost mechanical growl. Not the unthinking hunger of the infected. Something different, something with purpose. We crept closer, peering around the corner of a collapsed storage shed. What we saw made my blood run cold. It wasn't a motor pool, it was a junkyard. And in the center of it, amidst mountains of scrap metal and rusting hulks of vehicles, a group of figures was at work. Not infected. Humans. 3 of them, heavily armed, wearing makeshift armor cobbled together from old tires and license plates. They were pulling a large caged trailer, the kind used to transport dogs, towards a dilapidated shed. The growling was coming from inside the cage, and the squeaking was the sound of its rusty wheels. "Survivors," Specs whispered, a hopeful tremor in his voice. "Or something worse," Thorne countered, his hand going to his shiv. His gaze was hard, suspicious. He'd learned the hard way that humans were often more dangerous than any monster. He was right. In the inmate versus zombie war, other survivors could be your greatest asset or your most brutal enemy, especially in a prison setting where trust was a foreign concept. These men looked like scavengers, bandits, and the cage? What were they dragging? As they pulled the cage past the gap in the scrap metal, I saw it. Not dogs, but something much more terrifying. 2 figures, naked, emaciated, thrashing violently inside the cage, their limbs contorted. Their eyes were dark, lifeless, infected. They were collecting infected. My mind reeled. Why? Why would anyone collect them? Unless they were using them as bait, as weapons, or worse, for some grotesque scientific experiment. "They're baiting them," I muttered, the words thick with disgust. "Or worse, they're using them." "We need to get to those vehicles," Thorne said, his voice low and urgent, "before they see us, before they use us." The 3 scavengers finished dragging the caged infected into the shed and closed the door. One of them, a massive man with a scarred face, lit a cigarette, the smoke curling around his cruel features. They stood guard by the shed, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. Our path to the motor pool was now blocked, and we were exposed. A new fear, colder than the last, settled over me. This wasn't just about escaping the prison. This was about navigating a world where the living were predators and the dead were their tools. My 24 hours to escape hell had just grown infinitely more complicated. We were no longer just running from death. We were running from a new kind of evil. My shoulder still throbbed where the infected had scraped me. I checked it again. No break in the skin, thankfully. Just a nasty bruise and a streak of grime. But the memory of its touch, its putrid breath, lingered. The smell of the junkyard, a mix of rust, oil, and distant decay, was now tainted by the faint, unsettling scent of burning tobacco from the scavengers. "We can't just walk in there," Specs whispered, his glasses reflecting the hazy morning light. "They're armed, and they're clearly not friendly." "No kidding," Thorne growled, his hand still on his shiv. These kind of guys, they see us, they see fresh meat. They'll take our clothes, our food, whatever we got, if they don't kill us first for sport." I nodded. Thorne knew the criminal mind better than anyone. He was right. We were 2 former inmates and a corporate spy, armed with steel bars, against 3 armed, organized, and clearly ruthless scavengers. This was a battle we couldn't win head-on. "We need a distraction," I said, my eyes scanning the junkyard. It was a maze of sharp metal, precariously stacked car parts, and abandoned vehicles. A perfect place for an ambush, or an escape. My gaze settled on a row of old, rusting fuel drums, stacked near the edge of the motor pool, not far from the shed where the scavengers had locked their caged infected. They looked old, weathered, but potentially flammable. And there were several vehicles near them, including a pickup truck that looked like it might still run. "The fuel drums," I said, pointing. "If we can cause a commotion there, draw their attention away from the vehicles." "How?" Specs asked, nervously adjusting his glasses. "We don't have anything to set them off, and getting close enough without being seen. Impossible." I looked at the discarded debris around us. A loose panel of corrugated iron, a pile of old tires. Then I saw it. A broken car battery, its terminals still sparking faintly, and nearby a coil of frayed electrical wire. "Specs, this was his department." "Specs," I said, "that battery, the wire, can you make a spark? Something to ignite those drums?" He looked at the battery, then the wire, then at the fuel drums, his eyes widening. "Potentially, but it would be dangerous, very dangerous, and loud." "Loud is good," Thorne interjected. "Loud means distraction." "But it's a long shot," Specs cautioned. "Those drums are old. They might be empty. Or the fuel might be too degraded to ignite properly. And the explosion, if it even happens, it could draw every infected for miles." "It's a risk we have to take," I stated, my voice firm. "We need those vehicles, and we need to get away from here." I paused, my gaze sweeping the junkyard. "Thorne, you're with me. We'll create the opening. Specs, you stay hidden. When we draw their attention, you make your move. Get to that battery, rig it up, and get out of there. Then meet us at the vehicles." "What vehicles?" Specs asked, eyes darting nervously. "The green pickup truck," I pointed. "It looks mostly intact. Meet us there. Hotwire it, if you can." Specs gulped, but nodded. "All right, I'll do my best." Thorne clapped him on the shoulder, a rare gesture of encouragement. "You got this, nerd. Don't screw up." We formulated a plan. Thorne and I would use the cover of the scrap metal to get closer to the scavengers, not to engage them, but to make enough noise to draw their attention. Once they were focused on us, Specs would sneak to the battery, rig the wires, and try to ignite the fuel drums. It was reckless. It was insane, but it was our only shot. We began our cautious approach, weaving through the labyrinth of rusting cars and jagged metal. The sun was higher now, its pale light cutting through the haze, making the scavengers' figures sharp and menacing. Their conversation, a low rumble, was just barely audible. They were talking about us, or rather, about people like us. "Another batch of fresh meat," I heard the scarred leader say, a cruel laugh accompanying his words. My blood boiled. We weren't meat, we were survivors. We reached a cluster of overturned cars, just 20 yards from the scavenger's position. I looked at Thorn. He nodded, his eyes hard. This was it. The Inmate versus Zombie war was temporarily on hold. Now it was just Predator versus Predator. I grabbed a loose exhaust pipe, heavy and rusted, and with a guttural roar, I hurled it at a stack of corrugated iron, sending it crashing to the ground with a deafening clang. The three scavengers immediately snapped their heads up, their rifles swinging towards the sound. "Who's there?" the leader roared, his voice thick with menace. "Come out, or we'll blow you to kingdom come!" Thorn and I broke cover, running towards a different section of the junkyard, staying low, making ourselves harder targets. "Hey, pretty boys, over here!" Thorn yelled, waving his angle iron. Their rifles immediately barked, spitting fire. Bullets whizzed past, kicking up dust and sparks as they ricocheted off scrap metal. We scrambled, dodging behind an old bus, the sound of gunfire deafening. "Now, Specs! Now!" I screamed, hoping he could hear me over the chaos. This was it, our desperate gamble. My 24 hours to escape hell depended on a scrawny corporate spy and a rusty car battery. Specs moved with a surprising burst of speed, darting from cover to cover, his glasses glinting in the light. He reached the battery, fumbling with the wires. The scavengers, still focused on Thorn and me, hadn't noticed him yet. We kept them distracted, dodging, weaving, making ourselves a nuisance, but never a static target. A sudden sharp crack from Specs' direction. Not a gun, but the sound of electricity shorten. Then a low whoosh and a bright orange flash. The fuel drums, they'd ignited. The explosion wasn't massive, but it was enough. A wall of fire erupted, sending thick black smoke billowing into the air, and a wave of heat washing over the junkyard. The scavengers were momentarily disoriented, turning, heads shielding their eyes. "To the truck! Go!" I screamed, pulling Thorn by the arm. We ran, scrambling over debris, heading straight for the green pickup truck, the one I'd marked earlier. Specs was already there, frantically working under the hood, sparks flying as he hot-wired the engine. The scavengers, recovering from the blast, were now yelling, their attention divided between the burning drums and us. One of them, faster than the others, broke away from his companions, rifle raised, running towards us. He was closing fast, too fast. "Almost got it!" Specs shouted, his voice strained. I didn't have time to reach for my steel bar. I grabbed a heavy wrench from the ground, just as the scavenger raised his rifle, aiming for Specs. No time to think, just act. I lunged, swinging the wrench like a baseball bat, connecting with the scavenger's head with a sickening thud. He staggered, his rifle clattering to the ground, and fell, unconscious. Not dead, but out of the fight. A moral dilemma for another time. The Inmate versus Zombie war had blurred all lines. "Get in!" Specs yelled, scrambling into the driver's seat. The engine sputtered, coughed, then roared to life with a satisfying rumble. Thorn pulled himself into the passenger seat, his eyes on the two remaining scavengers, who were now running towards us, screaming. I jumped into the bed of the truck, grabbing the wrench again, ready to fight if I had to. Specs slammed the truck into gear, throwing us backward as it lurched forward, tires spinning on the loose dirt. We tore through the junkyard, scattering debris, leaving the burning fuel drums and the two furious scavengers behind. The prison, a dark stain on the horizon, was fading rapidly. We were free, or at least free from that particular hell. As the truck sped away, leaving the prison and its immediate dangers behind. A wave of exhaustion washed over me. The adrenaline that had fueled me for the last few hours was dissipating, leaving behind a dull ache in my muscles and a throbbing pain in my shoulder. The sun was fully risen now, painting the sky in pale oranges and yellows, illuminating a world that was both terrifyingly familiar and utterly alien. Specs, surprisingly, was a competent driver, expertly navigating the overgrown, crumbling roads that led away from the prison. Thorn sat beside him, his gaze fixed on the rearview mirror, watching for any sign of pursuit. The scratch on his arm was definitely inflamed, a dark red line against his pale skin. He tried to hide it, but I'd seen it. We all had. "Where to?" Specs asked, his voice still a little shaky, but tinged with a newfound confidence. I thought about it. "North. Away from the cities. We need to find somewhere defensible, away from everything." The prison was just a microcosm. The real inmate versus zombie war was out here, in the vast, unknown expanse of what remained of the world. Thorn grunted. "Good idea. Cities are death traps. Too many people, too many places for them to hide." As we drove, the landscape slowly changed. The prison's outer perimeter, a grim reminder of our recent past, eventually gave way to dense forests and rolling hills. The roads became less maintained, pocked with potholes and abandoned vehicles. Some were overturned, others stripped, standing testament to the chaos that had swept through here. And everywhere, the silence, a deep, unsettling silence, broken only by the hum of the truck engine and the rustle of leaves in the wind. My mind drifted back to the prison, the screams, Mikey, the guard, Lou, Thorn's scratch. The image of the scavengers and their caged infected made my stomach churn. The line between right and wrong, between good and evil, had become terribly blurred. What would I have done if I'd been trapped outside? Would I have become like those scavengers? What would you do to survive? How far would you go? The question burned in my mind, a terrifying open loop for the future. "Look," Speck said, pointing to a distant plume of smoke rising on the horizon. "East. Looks like a fire. Probably a city." I nodded, my jaw tight. Another city lost. Another place that had been swallowed by the tide. We were driving away from it, away from the destruction. But to what? A new life? Or just a different kind of death? Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows. We hadn't seen another living soul, or another infected, since leaving the junkyard. It was unnerving, too quiet, like the world had simply ended. "We need to stop soon," Thorn said, breaking the silence. His voice was hoarse. He shifted uncomfortably, his hand touching his arm. "Fuel's running low, and I need to rest." I knew what he meant. He was feeling the onset. The fear in my gut intensified. We had to face it. We found a small abandoned gas station tucked away off the main road. The pumps were dry, obviously drained long ago. But there was a small convenience store, its windows shattered, shelves overturned, and, crucially, a mechanic's garage attached with what looked like an old fuel tank behind it. "We'll try here," I said. "Specs, see if you can siphon anything from that tank. Thorn, you and I clear the store. We need supplies, and keep an eye out." The air around the gas station was heavy with the smell of stale food and dust. No immediate signs of infected, but the broken windows and scattered debris hinted at a previous struggle. The silence was almost louder than any noise. We moved cautiously into the convenience store, our steel bars raised. Overturned shelves, empty registers, and scattered trash were all that remained. No bodies, no infected, just a pervasive sense of emptiness. We found a few cans of stale peaches, a box of crackers, and some bottled water that thankfully hadn't been tampered with. It wasn't much, but it was enough to survive for another day, another few hours. Specs was already at the fuel tank behind the garage, cursing under his breath as he tried to figure out a way to tap into it. The truck was almost empty. We needed fuel. Without it, we were stranded. Suddenly, a loud clang from the garage. We froze, our heads snapping towards the sound. "Specs?" I called out, my voice tight. No answer, only the frantic scramble of feet. And then a guttural moan. "Damn it!" Thorne swore, pushing past me, heading for the garage entrance. "He found 'em!" I followed, my heart pounding. Specs was our ticket out. We couldn't lose him now. As I burst into the garage, I saw him, pinned against a workbench, desperately trying to fend off two infected with a tire iron. He was swinging wildly, his glasses askew, pure terror in his eyes. "Thorne, left!" I yelled, pointing. He didn't hesitate, bringing his angle iron down on the infected closest to Specs. The skull exploded. The other one turned, its attention now on us. I moved, aiming for its head, but it was faster than the last one's, surprisingly agile. It lunged, its decaying fingers reaching for my face. I brought my steel bar up to block, felt its weight, its strength. This one was fresher, stronger. The inmate versus zombie war was never truly over. Thorne, despite his fatigue and his worsening arm, was a force of nature. He roared, slamming his bar into the infected side, drawing its attention away from me. I seized the opportunity, brought my bar around, and delivered a crushing blow to its temple. It dropped, twitching. Specs, shaken but alive, stared at us, breathing hard. "Thank you," he whispered, wiping a smear of blood from his glasses. I thought I was dead." "Don't thank us yet," I said, my gaze fixed on Thorne's arm. The scratch was swollen, an angry purple, and his eyes, they had a strange, unfocused quality. "Thorne, we need to talk." He looked at me, a defiant glint in his eyes. "What, you think I'm turning? I'm fine, just tired." But his voice lacked conviction. "No, you're not," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "You're getting worse. We all know what happens." A silence fell, heavy and suffocating. The reality of our situation, the brutal truth of this new world, hung in the air. We had escaped the prison, but we were still trapped, now by the grim inevitability of infection. My 24 hours to escape hell had brought me to a new kind of hell, one where even our own friends could become monsters. "What do we do?" Specs asked, his voice barely a whisper. The rhetorical question hung in the air, a terrible weight. What would you have done? Would you condemn your friend or risk everything? I looked at Thorne, at the man who had fought beside me, who had helped us escape, and I knew the choice that had to be made. The air in the garage was heavy, not just with dust and the lingering scent of stale gasoline, but with unspoken dread. Thorne stood rigid, his back to us, his shoulders hunched. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I could hear the distant chirping of crickets, a perverse contrast to the grim reality unfolding before us. "Thorne," I said, my voice raw, "look at me." He slowly turned, His eyes glazed, bloodshot. The purple discoloration on his arm had spread, creeping up towards his shoulder. A faint tremor ran through his body, small at first, then more pronounced. He looked like a man fighting a losing battle against an invisible enemy. And he was. "I can still fight," he rasped, his voice rough. "Still help. I ain't one of them yet." "No," I agreed, my heart aching. "But you will be, and we can't risk it. Not with Specs, not with the fuel, not with everything we've gone through to get this far." My voice cracked. This was the hardest thing I'd ever had to do. Harder than killing a stranger, harder than leaving Mikey to die. This was sacrificing a comrade. Specs was silent, his face pale, his eyes wide behind his glasses. He looked away, unable to meet Thorne's gaze. Thorne stared at me, a flicker of understanding, then despair in his eyes. He knew. He'd seen it before, too. The transformation was swift, merciless. "So, that's it?" he asked, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Dump me in a ditch, after all we did?" "No," I said, shaking my head. "We find you a place, a quiet place. We give you a choice." "Your way." He considered it for a long moment, then nodded slowly. The fight seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a terrible resignation. "Fine," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But no ditches. I ain't going out like some dog." My eyes scanned the garage. A heavy chain hung from a beam, meant for lifting engines. It ended in a thick, rusty hook. A hoist. And in the corner, a small enclosed office with a heavy reinforced door. "That office," I pointed. "It looks secure. You go in there. Lock yourself in. No noise, no struggle. When it's done, we'll leave. And we'll remember you, Thorne. We'll remember what you did for us." He looked at the office door, then at us, a hint of something resembling gratitude in his deadening eyes. "Don't mourn me, Kane. Just survive. Get out of this hellhole for good. That's all I ask." He then looked at Specs. "And you, nerd, finish that damn fuel. Don't die for nothing." With one last deep breath, Thorne turned and walked towards the office. His gait was already stiffening, a subtle shuffle creeping into his steps. He opened the door, stepped inside, and without another word, pulled it shut. The heavy clunk of the lock echoed in the silence, sealing his fate. Specs and I stood there, stunned, listening. For a long minute, there was only silence. Then a low moan, muffled but distinct, came from behind the office door. Then another, and another. Thorne was gone. The inmate versus zombie war had claimed another one of us. Specs let out a shaky breath, finally looking up at me. His eyes were brimming with tears. I never thought I'd see a man face death like that. "He was a survivor," I said, my own voice thick with emotion. "Right to the end." I blinked back the burning in my eyes. This was no time for weakness. We had a job to do. "All right, Specs, fuel, now, before any more of them show up." We worked in silence. The memory of Thorne, the sound of his moans, a chilling presence in the garage. Specs, energized by a grim determination, finally managed to hotwire the fuel tank, jury-rigging a pump with some old hoses in the truck's battery. The smell of gasoline filled the air, acrid and potent. The fuel gauge slowly climbed. We had enough to get us far, very far. As the last drops of fuel were siphoned, the sun began to set, casting long crimson shadows across the desolate landscape. The 24 hours to escape hell were almost up. We had made it out of the prison. We had survived. But the cost was immense. Specs capped the tank, his face smeared with grease and sweat. "Done," he said, his voice hoarse. "We can go now." I nodded, my gaze sweeping the horizon. The distant plume of smoke from the burning city was still visible, a dark smear against the twilight sky. The 24 hours to escape hell were almost up. We had made it out of the prison. We had survived. But the cost was immense. Specs capped the tank, his face smeared with grease and sweat. "Done," he said. "We can go now." I nodded, my gaze sweeping the horizon. The distant plume of smoke from the burning city was still visible, a dark smear against the twilight sky. The crickets chirped louder now, the sounds of the wilderness returning as the artificial light of day faded. We climbed into the pickup truck, the engine sputtering to life with a hopeful roar. Specs took the wheel, his hands tight on the steering wheel. I sat in the passenger seat, my steel bar across my lap, my eyes scanning the approaching darkness. "Where now?" Specs asked again, his voice softer this time. "North," I repeated, "always north, away from the population centers. We find a secure place, a place where we can make a stand, a place where we can rebuild, if there's anything left to rebuild." Specs nodded and put the truck in gear. The headlights cut through the gathering gloom, illuminating the cracked pavement and the encroaching forest. We were driving into the unknown, into a world utterly transformed. The inmate versus zombie war had just begun for real. The truck sped down the deserted highway, leaving the gas station, the prison, and Thorne's sacrifice behind. The night was a black canvas, punctuated by the truck's headlights and the faint ghostly glow of distant city fires. We were two unlikely companions, a hardened inmate and a terrified corporate spy, navigating a world that had gone irrevocably mad. I watched the road ahead, my mind racing. My 24 hours to escape hell had morphed into a perpetual journey of survival. We had broken free, but freedom was just another word for infinite danger. Every rustle of leaves, every distant howl, every unexpected shadow played tricks on my nerves. The phantom smell of decay lingered in my nostrils. "We need a plan, Kane," Specs said, breaking the long silence. His voice was steadier now, tinged with a new resolve. "We can't just drive aimlessly. We need a destination, a safe zone, a place where we can be safe." I grunted. Safe zones were a myth, a fairy tale for the naive. Every safe place eventually fell. But he was right. We needed a direction, a purpose beyond simply running. My mind drifted to a memory, a childhood camping trip with my family, a remote ranger station nestled deep in the mountains, miles from any town. It had been abandoned for years even then, a relic of a bygone era. No one would think to look there. No one would stumble upon it by accident. It was perfect. "The old Blackwood Ranger Station," I said, the words surprising even myself. "North, up in the Appalachians. It's isolated, defensible, and it's far from anything resembling civilization." Specs' eyebrows rose. "You know where that is, and how to get there?" "I do," I confirmed. A small flicker of hope, The first I'd felt in days sparked within me. A destination, a goal, a reason to keep going. The drive north was long and arduous. We avoided major roads, sticking to dirt tracks and secondary highways, winding through forests that seemed to stretch on forever. The truck, battered and grimy, became our sanctuary, our mobile fortress. We saw evidence of the collapse everywhere. Abandoned cars, scattered luggage, even a few lone figures shambling blindly along the roadside, their vacant stares a chilling reminder of the inmate versus zombie war that had claimed so many. We took turns driving, snatching a few hours of uneasy sleep. My dreams were a kaleidoscope of screams, moans, and Thorne's face, distorted and gray. I woke up with a gasp, my heart hammering, my hands gripping my steel bar. Specs, ever vigilant, simply offered me a can of peaches. We ate in silence, the stale fruit a luxury in this new reality. On the third day, as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery hues, we finally saw it. A faint, winding dirt road, almost completely overgrown, leading into a dense thicket of pines. "This is it," I said, my voice low. "The turnoff." The track was barely passable, the truck bouncing and scraping against branches, but Specs skillfully navigated it. The forest grew denser, the air cooler, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. After another hour of slow, careful driving, the trees finally parted, revealing a small clearing. And there it was, the Blackwood Ranger Station. It was exactly as I remembered it. A small, sturdy log cabin, weathered but intact, nestled against a backdrop of towering peaks. A covered porch, a small outhouse, and a well pump. No lights, no smoke, no signs of life, or unlife. "Looks clear," Specs whispered, his voice tinged with awe. "It's perfect." I killed the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. We sat for a moment, listening. Only the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird. No moans, no shuffling. "All right," I said, gripping my steel bar. "Specs, you stay in the truck. Keep the engine running. Keep watch. I'll clear the cabin." He nodded, his face pale. I grabbed my bar, checked a small pistol I'd found in the gas station garage. 2 rounds left, not much, but something. And slowly, cautiously, approached the cabin. Every step was deliberate, every sense on high alert. The inmate versus zombie war had taught me paranoia was a survival trait. The front door was old wood, splintered and faded, but still intact. I pushed it open slowly, steel bar raised. The interior was dark, dusty. A single shaft of golden light filtering through a grimy window illuminated motes of dust dancing in the air. The smell of old wood, damp earth, and something else, stagnant air. No smell of decay, no sign of struggle. I moved through the cabin, clearing each room. A small living area with a stone fireplace. A kitchen with a rusted stove. 2 bedrooms, bare and empty. All clear, no infected, no living, just silence, and the dust of years. "Clear!" I shouted from the porch, my voice echoing in the stillness. Specs drove the truck closer, relief flooding his face. He parked it, and we began to unload our meager supplies. The cans of peaches, the crackers, the water, my steel bar, Thorn's angle iron. We were here. We had made it. As the last rays of sunlight faded, plunging the mountains into a deep purple twilight, we built a small fire in the fireplace. The warmth was a physical comfort, a primal reassurance against the encroaching darkness. Specs and I sat in front of it, sharing a can of peaches, the sweet, syrupy fruit tasting like ambrosia. "We did it, Kane," Specs said, a genuine smile finally gracing his lips. "We really did it. We escaped hell." I looked at the dancing flames, at the impenetrable darkness beyond the cabin windows. "For now," I corrected him, "this isn't an end, Specs. It's just a temporary ceasefire. The inmate versus zombie war is far from over. This is just the beginning of a new fight. A fight for more than just survival. A fight for a future." He nodded, his smile fading, replaced by a thoughtful expression. "What do we do now?" "We rest," I said, leaning back against the rough log wall, the heat of the fire soaking into my tired bones. "We plan, we secure this place, we scavenge, we survive, and we remember the ones we lost." My mind went to Thorn, to his courage, his sacrifice, to my family, to the world that was. I pulled out my steel bar, ran my thumb over its cold, unforgiving surface. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol, a reminder of where I'd come from, what I'd done, and what I was capable of. The dashboard clock in the truck, still running, read 23:59, midnight. The 24 hours to escape hell were officially over. The clock reset. The next chapter began. As the fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls, I knew the journey was far from over. This ranger station was a temporary haven, a moment of respite in a world forever changed. The threats were still out there, both dead and living. We had survived the initial chaos, escaped the prison's walls, and found a temporary sanctuary. But the true test, the long, arduous battle for existence, had only just begun. The embers of our fire cast a flickering glow, reflecting in my tired, resolute eyes. We had found a place to catch our breath, a moment of peace. But beyond these walls, the inmate versus zombie war raged on, relentless and unforgiving. And we would be ready for it. What new horrors would dawn with the sunrise? What desperate choices would tomorrow demand? The only certainty was that we would keep fighting. We would keep surviving. And as long as we did, there was hope. A fragile, desperate hope in a world consumed by despair.